The wind on Corin 6 did not whisper. It screamed. It clawed at the ground like a starving beast, dragging frozen sand across the endless plains of ice. The sky was the color of bruised metal, thick with storm clouds that rolled like mountains. Snow came in sideways sheets, slicing across the horizon, bearing everything it touched. Machines, rocks, bones. Nothing moved, nothing lived, except for a tent. It stood alone, half buried in white, tethered by old ropes and stubbornness. Inside, a man named Callan Ward sat cross-legged beside a humming heater unit. His breath fogged the air. His jacket was patched with a dozen lives, his hands cracked and raw from cold work. He stared into the steam rising from a metal cup of water, not because it comforted him, but because it was the only thing left that was warm. This planet was not meant for people, but Callan was not most people. He had come here to be forgotten, and so far it was working, until the sound came. At first he thought it was the storm shifting, a heavy gust, a pressure shift in the canvas. But no, this was different, slower, heavier. Footsteps. He reached for the pulse pistol at his side, fingers tightening around cold metal. Another sound, a soft thump. Then silence. He stood slowly, knees stiff, and moved toward the flap. His fingers hovered at the edge. "Who's out there?" he called out. Nothing, just the wind. But he opened the flap anyway, and she collapsed into his arms. She was light, too light. Her skin was icy to the touch, pale blue and glowing faintly beneath a dusting of snow. Her hair was silver and tangled with frost. Her eyes fluttered open just long enough to find his. "You are not like the others," she whispered. Then she fell unconscious. Callan did not ask questions, not yet. He pulled her inside, sealing the flap tight against the storm. He unrolled the emergency blanket and wrapped it around her shaking body, turned the heater to full, and placed a heat patch on her chest. Her skin shimmered beneath the dim light, marked with glowing lines and symbols, some like scars, others like art. He did not touch them. He only watched her face. So strange, so cold, so broken. He gave her water, one sip at a time. Her lips were turning purple. Her pulse was faint, but there. She trembled, then went still. Callan sat back. "Who are you?" He whispered it to himself. "What were you running from, Snowgirl?" Hours passed. The storm howled louder, but inside the tent, the only sound was the slow return of breath. She stirred once, then again. Her fingers twitched. Her eyes opened, pale violet, glowing soft. She looked around in confusion, then sat up too fast. He raised his hands. "Easy. You're safe." She blinked. Her breathing slowed. "They will be looking for me," she said. "Who?" She shook her head. "I cannot say." "Why not?" "Because if you know, they will hurt you too." Callan frowned. "Look, lady, you almost died out there. I think I deserve to know something." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I escaped. From a ship. Delivered," she said. "I was supposed to be delivered." "To who?" "To someone who thinks owning people is tradition." That word hit him hard. Owning. Callan had been in wars. He had seen what that word did to people. She looked at him again, voice softer now. "I did not know where to go, but your signal, it felt different." "How?" "It felt quiet, kind." He didn't know how to answer that. He didn't think he was kind, just tired. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah, I'm Callan." She nodded, then looked away. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, if they come, do not give me up, not even if they offer you everything." Callan watched her. She did not look royal. She did not look powerful. She looked scared, and he had seen too many faces like that before. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Then the scanner beeped. He turned to the control pad. Outside, through the storm, a dark shape moved low across the sky. A ship. Slow. Watching. They found her trail. He looked back at Sarah. She met his eyes. Afraid, but trusting. He grabbed his rifle. "We stay warm tonight, but tomorrow, we run." The storm raged on, but the tent held. Barely. Snow slapped against the canvas like fingers clawing at the walls, and the wind screamed like something ancient trying to be heard. The heater unit crackled softly in the corner, casting a dim orange glow over the narrow space. Every few minutes the power flickered, but it held. Inside it was still. Not peaceful, but still. Sarah sat near the heater, wrapped in the thick thermal blanket, knees pulled to her chest. Her fingers trembled as she held the metal cup of warm water. Steam drifted up into her silver hair, catching the light like a halo of frost. Callan sat across from her, watching the scanner. The ship had vanished from the screen. But he knew better. They were circling. They always circle. "They're looking for you," he said quietly. Sarah didn't look up. They always look until they catch what they call theirs. "You said you escaped," he said. She nodded. "From a ship?" "Yes." "Were they human?" Her head snapped up. "Number worse." Callan raised an eyebrow. She hesitated, then looked down at the water in her cup, her voice barely more than breath. "My own people. Royal blood doesn't protect you when you break tradition." He said nothing for a moment. "What kind of tradition?" She stared at the floor. "Where I'm from, some girls are given away. Not for love, not for choice, but to tie bloodlines, to keep power pure." Callan's jaw clenched. "They call it sacred," she whispered. "I call it a cage." He didn't speak. Not right away. He just leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady. "You ran, yes, and I was never meant to survive. Just disappear." He nodded slowly. "Why come here?" "Because your signal didn't feel like a trap." "You could feel that?" "Not with my eyes," she said. "With instinct. With silence." He blinked. "You felt silence?" "Everyone else broadcast noise," she said. "Threat. Ego. But you..." She looked up. "You were just quiet." Callan looked away, unsure what to say to that. No one had ever described him like that before. Quiet wasn't something he tried to be. It was something he had become. Later that night, he unrolled a second blanket from his supply crate and placed it on the opposite side of the tent. "Get some rest," he said. "We move at first light." "To where?" "North side. I have a beacon buried there, encrypted. Will it bring help?" He shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe options." Sarah crawled under the blanket, her movements slow and uncertain. Her body still shook, not just from cold, from memory. She watched him for a long time as he checked the equipment. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" Callan didn't look up. "Should I be?" Some would say yes. "I don't listen to some." That made her smile. Just a small one. But it was real. Hours passed. Callan slept lightly, one eye always half open, one hand resting near his rifle. The heater hummed. The storm outside howled. Inside the tent, warmth held. Just barely. Sarah couldn't sleep. She watched the shadows dance along the fabric walls. Her breath was slow, measured. Then, crunch, not wind. Footsteps. She whispered. "Callan." He was already awake. "Stay down," he whispered. She pulled the blanket tight and ducked low. Callan crawled to the far corner, unzipped a hidden emergency panel, and peered through the narrow slit. Outside, 4 tall figures moved through the storm. Not human, not fully alien. Something in between. Armor shimmered blue in the snowlight. Royal hunters. One knelt where Callan's boot prints had faded. Another raised a glowing scanner. It pointed toward the tent. Callan zipped the panel shut and turned back to Sarah. "They're coming," he said. "If they see me, they'll mark you too." She looked at him. "What are you doing? Buying us time. They'll kill you." "Maybe, but not before I show them what quiet really means." He pulled a spare coat from his pack and stuffed a heat core inside. It glowed like a beating heart. Then he unzipped the main flap, tossed the decoy. The thermal shape tumbled into the snow. The hunters rushed forward, weapons raised, empty. By the time they reached it, Callan and Sarah were already gone, into the dark, into the wind. Their footprints vanished behind them, like they were never there. The storm didn't chase them, it watched. From the ridge, from the sky, from the low whine of distant engines cloaked by clouds, It watched with patient eyes, the kind that don't blink, because they know time is on their side. Callan and Sarah moved through the snow like shadows, slow, careful, quiet. The planet groaned beneath their feet. Ice cracked in thin webs across deep black ground, and every breath fogged and vanished like a fading thought. Behind them, there were no more footprints. The wind erased everything. "How far?" Sarah asked. Her voice was muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. "North Ridge," Callan said. "A few more kilometers. The beacon is buried there. Will it bring help?" He glanced at her, eyes sharp beneath his hood. "Not sure, but it might bring options." She nodded. That was enough. They entered the ashlands just after nightfall, a dead zone from a war that no one remembered anymore. The snow turned gray here, the sky too. Everything looked the same, like a photograph smudged with ash and regret. "What happened here?" she asked. "Battlefield," he said. 20 years ago. Fusion bombs. Nothing survived." She looked around. "Nothing?" He stopped walking. Almost nothing. The wind dropped lower. The silence thickened. No birds, no beasts, just the crunch of boots over forgotten war. By the time they stopped to rest, the world had turned to glass. The ground was hard and uneven, littered with twisted metal bones. Towers bent sideways under layers of ice, and beneath it all, something hummed, faint and deep, like the last breath of a sleeping giant. Callan set up a small dome. Not a tent, just a shelter. Low profile, no heat, only insulation. They crawled inside shoulder to shoulder, pressed close because the space was small, not because they were ready for it. Her fingers were blue at the tips. He handed her a heat capsule. "Bite this, it warms your core." She did, then leaned her head back and whispered, "I don't think I've ever been this tired." "Welcome to my kind of vacation," he said. She laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. "I don't understand you." "That's okay," he replied. "I don't either." They sat in silence for a while, not because they had nothing to say, but because silence was safer than truth. Later, as the dome dimmed, she spoke again. "Do you regret helping me?" He didn't open his eyes. "Number, even if it kills you, especially then." She turned to him, blinking. "Why?" He opened one eye, not smiling, just seeing. "Because I've seen what silence does to people." He paused. "I stayed quiet once. Someone innocent died. I won't let that happen again." Sarah looked down. "I was supposed to belong to someone. Not marry, belong. Like a gift." "You're not a gift," Callan said. "You're a person." Her eyes filled just a little. She didn't blink it away. "Thank you," she whispered. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. But beneath the ice, something stirred. An old machine. Half broken, half alive. Waiting. Its sensors twitched. Its ancient protocol reawakened. It had a purpose. A name etched in code. Protect the bloodline. The girl in the dome glowed faintly. The machine felt her. Target acquired. Status. Royal. Action. Activate. The night had settled into stillness. Not peace, not safety. Just the kind of stillness that hangs right before something breaks. Inside the emergency dome, Callan sat with his back against the curved wall. One hand rested on his pulse rifle. The other near the emergency beacon, still off, still silent. He wasn't asleep. Not really. He hadn't slept fully in years. Sarah was curled beside him, wrapped in the heat blanket, her breathing soft and even. Her face had lost some of its tension, but not all. In sleep, she still looked ready to run. Above them, stars sparkled through the thin atmosphere. Too far, too cold, unreachable. Below them, something blinked. A buried signal, long dormant. It was old, very old. Mechanical limbs shifted under layers of frozen ash. Sensors activated. Memories ran their final loop. Royal marker detected. Target, proximity breach. Command, protect. A crack echoed through the ground. Callan sat up. "What was that?" Sarah opened her eyes. "I don't know." He reached for his scanner. Too late. The earth exploded beside them. The dome split like paper under a fist. Snow and debris burst upward in a geyser of frost and shattered ice. Callan grabbed Sarah and rolled, pulling her out of the collapsing shelter. Something rose from the crater, massive, metallic, covered in frost and rust. It had once been painted silver. Now it was the color of bones and time. Two glowing red eyes flared to life beneath a cracked visor. A chest plate hissed and split, revealing old tech pulsing faintly. Its arms were not smooth but jagged, as if repaired too many times by someone who no longer cared for perfection. Sarah stared at it in horror. "What is that?" Callan raised his weapon. "An auto guardian," he said, "used to protect royal bloodlines." "Then why is it attacking?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the target. "Maybe it thinks I'm the threat." The machine scanned them both, its head tilted. Calculations ran behind its eyes. Target 1, royal. Target 2, unknown, armed, aggressive. It raised an arm. A weapon unfolded from its wrist with a hiss. Callan fired first. The bolt glanced off the machine's shoulder, leaving only a scorch mark. The Guardian didn't flinch. It turned to Callan, locked on, and charged. Callan rolled aside as the ground behind him exploded. The machine turned again, ready to finish. But Sarah stepped in front of him. "Stop," she shouted. "He's not hurting me." The machine paused, scanning. Her voice rose. "He saved me. Processing. Recalculating." The cannon lowered a few degrees, but the eyes still glowed. Waiting. "Can you shut it down?" Callan asked. "Maybe. If I can reach its control port." "Then do it," he said. "I'll cover." Sarah nodded once. She ran. The machine twitched. Callan fired again, drawing its attention, dodging left as a plasma shot scorched the air where he had stood. Sarah reached the side panel. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. The access port was ancient, alien, familiar, and hated. She typed a code, her family's code, one she had never used, never wanted to use. The machine hesitated. Voice command accepted. Status, danger passed. The Guardian froze, then shut down. Its body collapsed forward, steam hissing from joints, metal groaning like a dying animal. It fell with a crash that shook the ice. Silence returned, except for the sound of Sarah breathing. Callan limped toward her, bruised, cut, but standing. That was new. She sat in the snow, legs shaking. "You're always getting injured for me," she said. He laughed. "You're just bad luck." She smiled, only a little. He held out a hand. She took it, for the first time since she'd entered his tent. She didn't feel like a guest. She felt like a teammate. Morning came slowly, not with sun, with silence. After the storm, after the Guardian, after the crash and fight and fire, silence returned like an old friend, slipping into every crack in the ice. Callan sat on a rock outside what was left of the dome, watching the steam rise from his hands. His fingers were scraped. His shoulder was bruised. He didn't complain. Sarah sat nearby, legs crossed, the blanket draped around her like a memory. Her breath curled in the air. Her hands rested in her lap. But something hung between them. Not fear, not awkwardness. Something heavier. Truth. She spoke first. "I need to tell you something." Callan looked at her. He didn't rush, didn't interrupt. He waited. She didn't look at him. "The people chasing me, they're not just royalty. They're the Council of Bondcraft." He blinked. "That's the top, isn't it?" She nodded. "The highest power on my world. What do they want with you?" She inhaled slowly. "They want me to reproduce." Callan froze. "What?" "My bloodline is rare, pure. It holds genetics they're afraid to lose. They want to bind me, not for love, not for choice, just to keep the line alive." She finally looked at him. They were going to force it. His jaw tightened. His fists clenched just a little. Not at her. Never at her. But he had heard stories like that before. During a war he never talks about. She kept going. "The tag inside me, it's genetic. They put it in when I was born. It's why the Guardian woke. It's why I can't hide." She looked at him, and for the first time her voice wavered. "Being near me puts you in danger." He nodded. "I figured that out." She waited, but he didn't say more. So she asked, "And you're still here?" Callan's voice was quiet. Because running alone breaks people. I've been there. You? He looked far across the snow. Once I was sent to destroy a base. Orders were clear, no survivors. We hit fast, burned everything. Sarah listened, unmoving. But it wasn't a base. It was a refugee camp. Kids, families, no weapons, just hiding. His jaw locked. I didn't know, not until it was too late. What did you do? I disobeyed, pulled 3 kids out of the fire, hid them in a wrecked crawler. He looked at the snow beneath his boots. Got court-martialed for it. Sarah moved closer. The children? They lived? He nodded, but I didn't. Not the part that believed in orders. Not the part that thought medals meant anything. She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. She held it. You understand more than you know. They sat like that for a long time. Not because they needed warmth, but because there was no one else left who understood them the way they understood each other. I'm not just a runaway, Sarah said. Not anymore. I'm a rebel by blood now. Then what do you want? She paused, took a breath. I want to live by my own choices. I want to decide who matters. What matters? Callan nodded. You've got one now. She blinked. A choice? You can keep running. He turned to her. Or we can stand. Together. She looked at him. Steady, clear. And if I choose you? He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. Then I choose you too. The wind returned that night, but it didn't howl. It whispered. A warning, thin and sharp, like a knife drawn across glass. Callan sat just inside the cave, watching the scanner flicker. The signal danced, stuttered, then glowed steady. A faint dot had appeared. Unregistered, fast, low altitude, scout drone. They found us, Sarah said quietly behind him. He nodded, closing the flap on the scanner. Then we move. Fast. To where? To the beacon. The real one. It's buried under the glacier. If we reach it, we might still get the message out. And after that, he looked at her. After that, we stop running. She didn't question him. She didn't ask for a plan. She simply said, then let's go. They packed quickly, what little they had. 1 blanket, 2 rations, a cracked rifle and half a charge. Sarah tightened her boots, then grabbed Callan's hand. No more hiding. No more. They moved across the ice, fast and low. The moon was sharp overhead, carving shadows into the snow. The wind had quieted, but it was a trap. Clear skies meant open targets. How far? Sarah asked, her voice low. 2 clicks. There's a cave, beacons buried inside. And after we activate it, we wait. Behind them, engines roared. Scout bikes, low, silent, close. They're coming, Callan said. Sarah didn't answer. She just grabbed his hand tighter. Move! They ran. Snow kicked up behind them. The ice cracked with each step. Blaster fire lit the sky in bursts of red and white. A bolt exploded near Sarah, sending shards into the air. Callan pulled her down into a crevice. They'll see us, she whispered. They already did. He tapped his wrist console. A hologram flickered to life. A map of the terrain. Old mining tunnels. We can cut through here. Will it hold? It has to. They dropped into the tunnel. Dark, cold. The walls were narrow, lined with rusted beams and frozen pipes. Every step echoed. It smelled of metal, ice, and memory. You've been here before? Sarah asked. Callan didn't answer right away. Then softly, this is where I hid the kids, the ones you saved? He nodded. We slept right there. 3 nights. No fire, no light, just breathing. What happened? Someone good came. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. The silence filled it in. Then, crack. The ceiling trembled. A drone dropped from above, landing hard. Its legs buckled but held. Its scanner flared red. It crawled after them like a spider with blades. Sarah turned and fired. Missed. Second shot. Hit the sensor. Blinded it. Callan spun, aimed high, and shot the fuel line above the drone. Boom. Steam exploded down, melting part of the tunnel. The drone shrieked and vanished under the icefall. They didn't wait. They ran. The cave was just ahead. Inside, it was quiet. Crystals glowed faintly in the walls. Frost shimmered like glass. And at the center, a black beacon tower, covered in ice, blinking slow and red. "We made it," Callan said. Sarah dropped to her knees, gasping. He wiped the beacon clean, inserted the chipped key, and flipped the switch. "Transmission active. How long until someone picks it up?" "Depends," Callan said. "On who's listening." He turned to her. "Are you?" She frowned. "What do you mean? You said you chose me. Do you still?" She stepped closer. "Steady. Software. Always." He touched her face gently. "Then whatever comes next, we face it together. Even if we don't win?" "Some fights aren't about winning," he said. "They're about being worth remembering." But outside the cave, a shadow landed in silence. Not a drone, not a scout, a person, a woman in black armor, battle-scarred, focused. And when she stepped forward into the light, Callan froze. Her voice was calm, familiar. "You never change." Sarah looked at him. "Who is she?" Callan didn't answer. The woman removed her helmet, blonde hair, sharp eyes, a scar down her cheek. "I'm the one he left behind," she said. "My name is Rhea, and I'm here to take you back." The cave trembled, not from wind, not from machines, but from something colder, recognition. Rhea stood near the entrance, one hand on her blaster, the other holding a small command device glowing faint red. Her armor was old military issue, not royal, not rebel, but something in between. Her voice didn't waver. Her stance didn't shift. But her eyes, they burned. Sarah stood still, breath shallow, gaze flicking between Callan and the woman with the scar. "Who is she?" she asked again. Callan didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he whispered, "She was my partner." "More than that," Rhea added, stepping closer. "We fought together, bled together, almost died together." Sarah took a step back. Rhea looked at her, eyes sharp, assessing. "You're the one, aren't you?" "The runaway." Sarah lifted her chin. "I didn't run from you." Rhea smiled, bitter. "Number? But you pulled him after you." She turned back to Callan. "You left me." He clenched his fists. "That mission, we were supposed to clear a target zone, but it was a refugee camp." "We didn't know," she snapped. "We should have known. And when I stayed behind to pull those kids out, you followed orders." Rhea's face twisted. "I thought you were dead." "I waited. You left me to answer alone." "I was court-martialed," he said quietly. "You were promoted." She didn't deny it. "I lived with the consequences," Callan added. "So did I. But that's not why you're here, is it?" Rhea raised the command stick. Its light brightened. "The Royal Council paid well for her return. Alive." She looked at Sarah. "You're lucky they still want you breathing." Sarah stepped behind Callan. He shifted to cover her without thinking. "You'll have to go through me." "I was hoping you'd say that." Rhea raised her blaster. Fire exploded across the cave. Callan dove left, pulled Sarah down behind a frozen ridge. The cave lit up with ricochets and smoke. Ice cracked from the walls. Rocks trembled. "She's too fast," Sarah whispered. "You can't beat her like this." "Wasn't planning to," Callan replied. He triggered a side tunnel collapse. Rocks crashed behind Rhea, blocking the entrance. But not for long. She pushed forward, fired again. A bolt grazed Callan's arm. He grunted, fell back, blood soaking his sleeve. Sarah screamed, "He's hurt!" She stood up, shaking, her blaster in hand. "Don't," Rhea warned. "You shoot me, you start a war. They'll come for both of you." Sarah's hands trembled. "I don't care anymore. I'm done running. You'd betray your people for this human?" Sarah didn't blink. "Number, I'd betray the system that tried to own me." The cave went quiet. Just the wind outside. Just the drip of melting ice. Callan sat slumped, breathing hard, pain in his eyes. "Sarah, you don't have to do this." She looked at him and smiled. "Yes, I do." She raised the blaster, but she didn't aim for Rhea. She aimed above, fired. The ceiling cracked. A cascade of snow and crystal collapsed. Rhea staggered back, stunned. Sarah dropped the weapon and ran, grabbed Callan's hand. "Run." They escaped through a back tunnel, breath hot, blood freezing, hearts pounding. Behind them, Rhea shouted, but didn't chase. She stood under falling snow, watching the light fade. And for the first time since she entered the cave, she hesitated. Outside, night had fallen. Stars burned above the ridge like cold fire. Callan collapsed beside a stone outcrop, hand pressed to his wound. Sarah wrapped a heat patch over the injury, fingers trembling. "She was your partner?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Once. Do you still care?" He looked at her. "Not like I care about you." She held his gaze. "Then don't leave me. I won't." Not again. Far above, in orbit, the council listened. Target escaped. Signal confirmed. Bounty failed. A voice growled. "Then activate full retrieval. Take them both, or burn the planet." The sky above the glacier was clear. Too clear. The stars looked down without blinking, their cold light catching on every jagged shard of ice, every exposed rock, every hidden signal waiting to be found. Callan stood at the edge of the ridge, his coat pulled tight, his breath fogging as he watched the horizon bleed red with the light of incoming ships. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't run. Behind him, inside the cave, Sarah finished sealing the beacon. Transmission stable. Loop mode engaged. Signal repeating. Every word they had spoken was already broadcasting across open channels, not just to allies, to everyone, to those who hunted, to those who feared, to those who still hoped. She stepped beside him, their shoulders touching. "They'll be here soon," she said. "I know. We can still run." He shook his head. "We've done enough running." She looked at him. "So what now?" "Now we stand." He turned to her, held out his hand. And this time, she didn't hesitate. They stood at the peak together, two figures wrapped in frost, in defiance, in something far greater than either of them had planned for. Behind them, the beacon blinked steadily, blue to white to blue again. A call, a confession, a beginning. The ships landed with the sound of thunder held just under the skin. Black-armored soldiers marched onto the ice, weapons drawn, visors glowing. A voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Step down, surrender the girl," Callan answered. "You'll have to melt the whole planet first. You will be erased." "Then erase us," Sarah called back. "But we'll still be remembered." The soldiers paused, confused, because their helmets were picking up something else. The broadcast, playing in every corner of the galaxy, on rebel screens, pirate frequencies, forgotten colonies, even deep inside royal channels. Their story was out. The girl who was supposed to be owned. The man who was supposed to be silent. The soldiers hesitated. One removed his helmet, then another, and another. A line broke. The commander shouted, "What are you doing?" But no one moved. Sarah turned to Callan. "Did we just—" "No," he said. "Not yet, but we started something." She smiled. "A real one. You said some fights aren't about winning." He nodded. "They're about being worth remembering." Months later, where the tent once stood, now there was a camp. Not royal, not military, just homes. Quiet fires, warm hands, safe space. A place for runaways, rebels, survivors. A place to stop running. Callan fixed old machines. Sarah taught kids to find their voice again. They never wore crowns. They never gave speeches. They didn't need to, because the galaxy remembered them. Two people who stood together when everything told them not to. And every time someone knocked at their door, shivering, scared, unsure, Sarah would open it with a smile. "You're safe here. I know what it's like to be cold. But here there's more than warmth. Some stories end with heroes, others with war. But this story, this ends with choice. And now it's your turn. What would you have done if you were Callan? If you were Sarah? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story stirred something in you, share it. Subscribe to HFY Obsession for more tales where love, freedom, and humanity always matter more than bloodlines or borders. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not run,